The year is 1840. As you close your eyes, imagine a world shifting from the vibrant greens of the English countryside to the monochromatic greys of the industrial city. For centuries, the rhythm of human life was dictated by the seasons and the soil. A family in a small village knew exactly where their food came from. The milk arrived warm from a neighbor's cow. The bread was baked from flour ground at the local stone mill, containing nothing but wheat, water, and salt. There was a transparency to life, a direct line between the earth and the table. But the steam engine changed the heartbeat of the world. As the 19th century progressed, the lure of factory wages drew millions away from the hills of Derbyshire and the fields of Norfolk. They moved into the soot-stained shadows of London, Manchester, and Birmingham. These new city dwellers found themselves packed into narrow brick tenements, where the air was thick with the smell of coal smoke, and the ground was perpetually damp. In this new urban landscape, the connection to the land was severed. There was no room for a kitchen garden in a slum. There was no pasture for a cow in the East End. The working class became entirely dependent on a new, unregulated network of urban grocers and street vendors. This was the dawn of a massive logistical nightmare. How do you feed 2 million people in a city with no refrigeration and horse-drawn transport? The answer, unfortunately, was found in the dark chemistry of greed. As you breathe deeply, consider the daily bread of the Victorian worker. In the country, bread was brown, hearty, and full of husk. But in the Victorian city, white bread was a status symbol. The poor craved the white loaves of the aristocracy, but they could not afford the high-quality flour required to make them. To meet this demand, unscrupulous bakers began to experiment. They found that by adding alum, a metallic salt used in dyeing fabric, they could bleach cheap floor sweepings and damaged flour until it looked snowy white. But the deception didn't stop at color. To add weight to the loaves, they mixed in fillers. Imagine the texture of a loaf that contained not just wheat, but plaster of Paris, chalk, and even finely ground piped clay. This was the first junk food, a product designed to look like a premium staple while offering almost zero nutritional value. It was a ghost of a meal. A child eating this bread felt full, but their bones grew soft from rickets because the bread they consumed was essentially a masonry product. The water, too, was a silent carrier of misery. In the village, water came from a clear spring or a deep well. In the city, it was pumped from the Thames, a river that served as both the city's drinking fountain and its primary sewer. The water was turbid, yellowish, and carried the invisible seeds of cholera and typhoid. To mask the taste of poor water, the Victorians turned to tea. Tea was the fuel of the Industrial Revolution. It provided a caffeine kick to a weary factory hand and a moment of warmth in a cold room. However, genuine tea was expensive. To lower the price, smouch was created. This was a mixture of used tea leaves gathered from the back doors of wealthy hotels, dried on hot copper plates, and recolored with poisonous sheep dung or black lead to make them look fresh. As the workers sat by their small fire, sipping a cup of tea, they were unknowingly ingesting heavy metals and filth. The migration had promised a better life, a modern life, but the reality was a slow erosion of health. The human body, built over millennia to thrive on the fruits of the sun and soil, was suddenly forced to process the byproducts of the industrial age. The gut was the first battlefield. Indigestion became a national hallmark of the Victorian era, not because people were overeating, but because their digestive systems were being abraded by the very chemicals used to improve their food. As the fog rolls in over the Thames in your mind, imagine the thousands of small shops on every corner. The windows are lit by flickering gaslight. Inside, the jars of pickles look a vibrant, unnatural green, a color achieved by boiling them with copper coins. The butter on the counter is actually a mixture of lard, flour, and yellow dye. The junk food of the 1840s wasn't just unhealthy, it was an imitation of life itself. It was a world where nothing was what it seemed, and the simple act of eating had become a dangerous gamble. The streets are quiet now, save for the distant clatter of a night watchman's stick. The millions who moved to the city are asleep, their stomachs filled with chalk and copper, their dreams perhaps haunted by the green fields they left behind. The Great Migration had succeeded in building the greatest empire on earth, but it had done so by sacrificing the literal substance of its people. As the city grew, so did its thirst. In the rural pastures, milk was a symbol of purity, a creamy, life-giving liquid that moved from the cow to the pail to the table in a matter of hours. But as the urban population of London and Manchester exploded, the geography of the dairy had to change. The lush meadows were now miles away, and the slow, swaying carts of the milkmen could not traverse the distance fast enough to keep the liquid from souring in the summer heat. To solve this, the Victorian city dweller saw the rise of the urban cowshed. These were not farms, but dark, subterranean dungeons located in the heart of the slums. Hundreds of cows were crammed into unventilated cellars, standing knee-deep in their own filth, never seeing a blade of grass or a ray of sunlight. These animals were fed distillery swill, the hot, fermented mash left over from the production of gin. This acidic, unnatural diet caused the cows' teeth to rot and their bodies to break out in sores. They became sickly, feverish creatures, yet they were the primary source of milk for the city's children. Because the cows were diseased, the milk they produced was thin, bluish, and watery. It lacked the rich yellow fat that customers expected. To the Victorian milk dealer, this was not a crisis of health, but a problem of aesthetics. They set to work improving the product with a cabinet of horrors. First, to give the thin, blue liquid the appearance of richness, they added nankin, a yellow dye, or a splash of molasses to mimic the color of cream. To create a frothy head on the milk, they whisked in calf's brains or starch. But the most dangerous addition was the preservative. To stop the milk from smelling of rot, dealers added boric acid or formaldehyde. These chemicals silenced the scent of decay, but they did nothing to kill the bacteria. The milk remained a thriving soup of tuberculosis and typhoid, masked by a clinical, chemical freshness. Perhaps most heartbreaking was the chalking of the milk. Dealers would dilute the milk with up to 50% water, often taken from the same polluted pumps that carried cholera, and then stir in crushed chalk or plaster of Paris to restore the opacity and weight. A mother buying a pint of milk for her weaning infant believed she was giving the child strength. In reality, she was feeding the baby a cocktail of sewage water, industrial bleach, and indigestible minerals. In the mid-19th century, infant mortality rates in the city soared. Thousands of children died of summer diarrhea or the wasting, their tiny bodies unable to process the slow-acting poisons being poured into their bottles. The milk, which should have been a foundation of life, had become a vector for death. It was a silent, white killer, delivered to the doorstep every morning, its lethality hidden behind the bright, cheerful whistle of the milkman. As you imagine the grey dawn of a London street, hear the clinking of the metal pails. It is a rhythmic, hypnotic sound, but in the Victorian era, it was the sound of a gamble. The milk of death was the ultimate junk food, a highly processed, chemically altered imitation of nature that exploited the most vulnerable members of society for the sake of a few extra pennies in a grocer's till. The cows in the cellars remained in the dark, and the children in the tenements grew pale and thin, their bones failing to knit together, their stomachs churning with the chemical remnants of the industrial dairy. The city continued to grow, fueled by a liquid that was more masonry than nourishment. Close your eyes and imagine the smell of a bakery. Typically, it is a scent associated with comfort, the warm, yeasty aroma of dough rising and the nutty crust of a loaf pulled fresh from the oven. But in the mid-1800s, if you were to walk down a narrow alleyway in a working-class district, the smell of the bakery was different. It was acidic, dusty, and sharp. This was the laboratory of the Victorian baker, a man caught between the rising cost of wheat and the desperate poverty of his customers. In the Victorian mindset, the whiteness of bread was a direct reflection of its purity. The upper classes ate best wheaten bread, which was snowy white and soft. The poor were expected to eat household bread, which was darker, grittier, and full of the bran and germ that we now know to be healthy. However, the Victorian worker viewed dark bread as a badge of shame, a sign of the workhouse or the peasant. They demanded white bread at a price they could afford. To meet this impossible demand, the bakers turned to a chemical known as alum, potassium aluminum sulfate. In the industrial world, alum was used for tanning leather and dyeing fabric. In the world of the baker, it was a miracle worker. When added to cheap, greyish flour, or even flour that had begun to rot and ferment, alum reacted with the proteins to bleach the bread a brilliant, deceptive white. It also allowed the bread to hold more water, making the loaf feel heavier and firmer than it actually was. But the chemistry of deception did not end with colour. The baker's cellar was often a place of dust. To stretch a sack of flour, they added fillers that had no business being in a human stomach. As you breathe in the cool air of your room, imagine the fine, white powder of plaster of Paris being sifted into the dough. Imagine the grit of chalk, the fine shards of piped clay, and even bone dust gathered from the refuse of the local butcher. These substances were cheap, they were white, and they were heavy. When a Victorian labourer sat down to his evening meal, the bread he broke was not a product of the field, but a product of the quarry. The physical toll of baker's dust was devastating. Alum is an astringent. It constricts the tissues of the body. For the thousands of children who lived on a diet consisting almost entirely of this bread, the alum caused chronic constipation followed by painful diarrhea. More sinisterly, it interfered with the body's ability to absorb nutrients. A child could eat a full pound of bread and still be starving at a cellular level. Their bellies would bloat not from health, but from the indigestible minerals, the plaster and the clay, sitting like stones in their intestines. Imagine the baker himself, working through the night in a damp underground kitchen. He is covered in a fine white dust, a mixture of flour and the chemicals he uses to doctor it. He is often sick, his lungs filled with the same irritants he sells to the public. He is not necessarily an evil man, he is a cog in a broken system. If he sells pure bread, it is grey and expensive, and no one will buy it. To survive, he must poison his neighbours. By the 1850s, it was estimated that nearly 90% of the bread sold in London's poorer districts was adulterated. The staff of life had become a staff of lead and lime. People walked the streets with bread faces, a pale, sallow complexion caused by the lack of iron and the presence of slow-acting toxins. The very food that was supposed to provide the energy for the Industrial Revolution was instead grinding the machinery of the human body to a halt. As the night deepens, visualize the thousands of loaves cooling on wooden racks across the city. They look beautiful, high, white, and crusty, but inside they are a hollow lie. They are the junk food of a nation that valued the appearance of wealth over the reality of health. The city sleeps, its stomach heavy with the dust of the earth, unaware that the next generation is being built out of plaster and alum. As the Victorian city expanded, the vibrant colours of the natural world began to fade behind a curtain of coal smoke. To the urban eye, anything bright and colourful was a luxury, a reminder of the gardens and hedgerows left behind. This psychological craving for color created a deadly opportunity for food manufacturers. Nowhere was this more apparent than in the production of preserved vegetables and pickles. In the 19th century, canning and bottling were still imperfect sciences. When vegetables like peas, beans, or gherkins were boiled for preservation, they naturally lost their vivid chlorophyll. They turned a dull, unappetizing brownish gray. To the Victorian consumer, this drab color suggested decay. They wanted their vegetables to look fresh, even if they had been sitting in a glass jar for 6 months. To achieve this impossible vibrancy, manufacturers turned to the chemistry of the metalworks. They discovered that by introducing copper sulfate, often called blue vitriol, into the boiling vats, the vegetables would undergo a chemical reaction that fixed their color. The copper ions would bind with the plant tissues, turning a dull gray pea into a brilliant emerald green specimen that looked more natural than if it had just been plucked from the vine. Some unscrupulous producers didn't even bother with chemical salts. They simply threw a handful of old copper halfpence into the boiling pot. The acid in the vinegar would leach the copper directly from the coins into the vegetables. The result was a jar of pickles that glowed with a toxic radiance. As you breathe slowly and steadily, imagine the dinner table of a middle-class Victorian family. They take pride in their London particular pickles or their bright green peas, believing they are serving their children a healthy dose of garden greens. But with every bite, they are ingesting a heavy metal that the body cannot easily expel. Copper poisoning is a slow and agonizing process. It begins with a metallic taste in the mouth and progresses to chronic nausea, cold sweats, and a persistent, gnawing pain in the abdomen. Over time, the copper accumulates in the liver and kidneys, leading to organ failure. For many Victorians, the mysterious decline or gastric fever that led to their early deaths was nothing more than the cumulative effect of the copper-laced aesthetics of their dinner table. This was the era of food as theatre. The appearance of the food mattered more than its biological reality. The manufacturers knew that a bright green pickle sold faster than a brown one, and in a marketplace with no labeling laws and no safety inspections, the profit motive was the only law that mattered. They were not selling nutrition, they were selling a visual lie. Even the preserves and jams were not safe. To give raspberry or strawberry jam a deep, lush red color, makers would often add red lead or carmine, crushed insects, or even more copper if they were aiming for a specific hue of plum. The shelf of a Victorian pantry was a kaleidoscope of industrial dyes and mineral poisons, all designed to mimic a freshness that had long since departed. The city quieted as the evening mist rolled in, but inside the stomachs of the people, the heavy metals were at work. The copper greens were a testament to a society that had become so disconnected from nature that it preferred a poisonous imitation to the dull reality of preserved food. The vibrancy of the Victorian table was a mask, a beautiful emerald green mask hiding the rot of an unregulated world. As we move deeper into the night, imagine the flickering gaslight reflecting off the glass jars of a Victorian sweet shop. To a child of the 1850s, these shops were palaces of wonder. After a week of eating grey bread and watery gruel, a single copper penny could buy a moment of intense, sugary bliss. The shelves were lined with hundreds and thousands, peppermint drops, and brightly coloured lozenges in shapes of hearts, animals, and stars. But sugar was a precious commodity, and the greed of the sweetmeat manufacturers was perhaps the most cynical of all. Because children were the primary consumers, the poisons used here were tailored to be attractive, vibrant, and deadly. In this era, there were no food coloring regulations. If a confectioner wanted to make a candy lemon yellow, they didn't reach for fruit extract, they reached for chromate of lead. If they wanted a deep, regal orange, they used red lead. For a vibrant emerald green sweet, the kind that looked like a sparkling jewel, they used Scheele's green, a compound made of copper and arsenic. Think of the irony of a child's treat. A penny lick of brightly colored sugar was often a concentrated dose of heavy metal. Arsenic in particular was a favorite of the Victorian trade. It was cheap, it provided a brilliant hue, and it was devastatingly effective at silencing the nervous system. A child who sucked on a green-tinted sugar plum wasn't just rotting their teeth, they were coating their stomach lining in a substance used to kill rats. To make the sweets cheaper, sugar was frequently padded with daff. This was a slang term for various mineral fillers. A bag of peppermint lozenges might contain only 20% sugar. The rest was a mixture of starch, plaster of Paris, and sulfate of lime. These fillers didn't dissolve easily. They would sit in the digestive tract of a small child like a cold, heavy stone, causing the wasting diseases and mysterious stomach cramps that Victorian doctors so often misdiagnosed. The most infamous example of this occurred in 1858, known as the Bradford sweets poisoning. A confectioner intended to buy daff, plaster, to bulk out his peppermint humbugs. By mistake, the druggist sold him 12 pounds of arsenic. The resulting sweets were so potent that they killed 20 people and made over 200 others violently ill within hours. Yet, even without such catastrophic mistakes, the normal sweets of the day were a slow-motion disaster. The cumulative effect of lead and mercury, often used to create silver-coated dragées, led to a generation of children with stunted growth, neurological tremors, and failing kidneys. They were the first generation to be poisoned for pleasure. As you listen to the silence of the night, imagine the colorful dust at the bottom of a candy jar. That dust was a mixture of sugar and the debris of the Industrial Revolution. The sweets were a junk food that offered a momentary escape from the grim reality of the slums, but the price of that escape was often a lifetime of ill health. The sugar was sweet, but its shadow was long, dark, and metallic. The shopkeepers would close their doors, blowing out the lamps, leaving the jars of arsenic green and lead-red candies to glow faintly in the moonlight, a beautiful, toxic promise of a treat that millions of Victorian lives would never truly recover from. By the middle of the 19th century, tea had become the lifeblood of the British Empire. It was more than just a drink. It was a social ritual that spanned the gap between the velvet-lined drawing rooms of the rich and the damp, crowded kitchens of the poor. For the factory worker, a pot of tea was the only thing that made a meal of dry, alum-bleached bread bearable. It provided warmth, a sense of comfort, and a caffeine-driven stamina to endure 14-hour shifts. But the demand for tea far outstripped the supply of genuine leaves arriving from China and India. This created a massive, shadow industry dedicated to the sophistication of tea. If you were a Victorian consumer, the chances that your tea leaves actually came from a tea plant were alarmingly slim. The swindle began with Lai tea. This was a trade term for a product that looked exactly like high-quality gunpowder tea, but contained no tea at all. It was manufactured by sweeping the floors of tea warehouses to collect dust and sweepings. This debris was then glued together using rice water or gum, rolled into small pellets, and faced with graphite or black lead to give it a convincing metallic sheen. When dropped into hot water, these pellets didn't unfurl into leaves. They simply dissolved into a muddy, gritty silt at the bottom of the cup. For those who couldn't afford Lai tea, there was smouch. This was a truly local Victorian invention. Gangs of leaf collectors would wait at the back doors of London's high-end hotels and restaurants to buy used tea leaves. These sodden, exhausted leaves were taken to secret workshops in the slums, where they were spread out on hot copper plates to dry. To bring the dead leaves back to life and give them a fresh green or black color, the manufacturers used a terrifying pharmacopoeia. For green tea they used Prussian blue, a pigment used in paint, or verdigris, the poisonous green rust from copper. For black tea they used logwood or black lead. To give the tea body and weight, they stirred in iron filings. As you settle into your pillows, imagine a Victorian woman brewing a pot for her family. She notices the water turns a deep, dark color almost instantly. She thinks she has bought a strong and economical brand. In reality, that darkness is the logwood dye leaching out. The metallic tang she tastes isn't the briskness of the tea, but the iron filings and the copper from the drying plates. The health consequences were subtle but devastating. Constant ingestion of graphite and lead led to chronic stomach inflammation and neurological issues. The copper caused nausea and liver damage, perhaps most insidiously because tea was often the only source of safe, boiled liquid for the poor. They drank it in enormous quantities, effectively microdosing themselves with industrial chemicals from morning until night. There was even a practice of adding catechu, a powerful astringent used for tanning leather, to make the tea feel grippy on the tongue, mimicking the natural tannins of high-quality leaves. This chemical would literally constrict the lining of the throat and stomach, leading to the chronic indigestion that became a hallmark of the age. The tea swindle was a masterpiece of Victorian deception. It took a product associated with health and sobriety and turned it into a delivery system for heavy metals and floor dirt. The teapot, sitting quietly on the hearth, was a bubbling vat of industrial byproducts, consumed by a nation that was literally being poisoned by its own favorite pastime. The sun sets over the docks of the East India Company, where crates of real tea are being unloaded for the wealthy, while in the dark alleys nearby, the smouch makers are busy drying their copper-stained leaves, preparing another day of toxic comfort for the millions who knew no better. For the Victorian working man, beer was not merely a luxury, it was considered a liquid food. In a world where the water was often a carrier of cholera, and the tea was a cocktail of floor sweepings, beer was perceived as a safe, strengthening necessity. It was the reward for a day of grueling physical labor and the social glue of the public house. However, as with everything else in the Victorian city, the demand for cheap and strong beer led to a dark evolution in the brewing vats. In the countryside, beer was brewed with malt, hops, yeast, and water. But in the crowded urban centers, malt and hops were expensive. To keep the price of a pint low while maintaining a high level of intoxication, brewers and publicans turned to a practice known as fuddling. To save money on expensive malt, brewers used cheaper sugars and molasses. However, this produced a weak, watery beer that lacked the kick the customers demanded. To compensate for this lack of strength, they introduced Cocculus indicus, also known as fishberries. This was a toxic seed imported from Southeast Asia that contained picrotoxin. It didn't provide a healthy alcohol buzz. Instead, it produced a staggering, semi-paralyzing stupor. It made the drinker feel drunk much faster, but it was a neurological poisoning rather than a simple tipsiness. But the bitterness of the beer, the characteristic flavor of hops, also had to be faked. Hops are a preservative and a flavoring agent, but they were costly. To mimic that sharp, bitter bite, unscrupulous brewers added strychnine, quassia, or even picric acid, an explosive chemical. These substances provided a harsh, lingering bitterness that tricked the palate into thinking the beer was well hopped and strong. The beer of bitterness also had to look the part. A good stout or porter was expected to have a thick, creamy head that lasted until the bottom of the glass. To achieve this cauliflower head on a thin, adulterated brew, publicans would stir in ferrous sulfate, green vitriol. This chemical reacted with the liquid to create a persistent, foamy lather. While it looked impressive in the dim light of the pub, it was highly irritating to the stomach and contributed to the chronic gut rot experienced by regular drinkers. Do you imagine the heavy wooden atmosphere of a Victorian pub, the floor covered in sawdust, the air thick with tobacco smoke? Consider the man at the bar. He drinks to forget his fatigue, unaware that his pint contains a menu of industrial poisons. The salt added to the beer by the publican ensured he stayed thirsty, prompting him to order a second and third pint. The grains of paradise and capsicum added a fake warmth to the throat, masking the fact that the beer was practically raw and unaged. The long-term effects of this junk beer were catastrophic. The pot belly of the Victorian drinker was often not fat, but a sign of a severely inflamed and enlarged liver, struggling to process the strychnine and heavy metals. The trembles that many workers experienced were frequently dismissed as alcoholism, when in fact they were the symptoms of chronic poisoning from the adulterants in their nightly pint. The Victorian beer industry had turned a traditional beverage into a delivery system for chemical stimulants and toxins. It was a profit-driven alchemy that turned water and chemicals into a substance that broke the minds and bodies of the laboring class. The tavern doors swing shut, the gas lamps are dimmed, and the city sinks into a heavy, drug-induced slumber. The beer of bitterness has done its work, leaving a nation to wake up with a hangover that was more chemical than alcoholic, a slow destruction of the very men who built the world's most powerful empire. As the midnight hour passes, let us turn our attention to the Victorian butcher's shop. In the countryside, meat was a rare and honest luxury. A pig was slaughtered, salted, and consumed within a local radius. But in the choking sprawl of the city, meat became a logistical nightmare. Cattle were driven hundreds of miles on foot, arriving in the city exhausted, bruised, and feverish. By the time the meat reached the butcher's block in a humid London summer, the process of decay was already well underway. To the Victorian butcher, freshness was a flexible concept. If a piece of beef began to turn grey and slimy, it wasn't thrown away, it was renovated. The first line of defense against the smell of rot was formaldehyde. This pungent chemical, normally used to preserve corpses in a laboratory, was wiped onto the surface of the meat. It killed the surface bacteria and tightened the flesh, giving it a deceptive firmness. But formaldehyde could not restore the red color of healthy blood. For that, the butcher turned to the needle. To make old, pale meat look like prime cuts, they injected it with saltpeter, potassium nitrate, or even red lead. If the meat was truly far gone green with mold and smelling of the grave, it was destined for the potted meat industry. Potted meats and sausages were the ultimate hiding places for the junk of the Victorian food chain. In these dark, damp processing rooms, everything went into the grinder. The gristle, the offal, the floor sweepings, and the meat that was too putrid to sell as a whole cut. To mask the sour taste of decay, they added massive quantities of salt and spice, which was often just more sawdust or floor dirt. To give these grey, blended masses an appetizing pink hue, they added bole Armenian, a red volcanic earth. This red clay provided a consistent color that fooled the eye, even as it added a gritty, earthy texture to the palate. The most terrifying aspect of the butcher's secret was the smaller creatures. In the unregulated urban markets, it was common for slink meat, the meat of animals that had died of disease rather than being slaughtered, to be sold to the poor. These animals were often riddled with trichinella, parasitic worms, or the bacteria of anthrax. Without modern health inspectors, the only thing standing between a family and a fatal infection was the butcher's conscience. which was often thinner than his cheapest cut of ham. As you breathe in the cool night air, imagine the Victorian family sitting down to a Sunday roast or a tin of potted beef. They see a rich red color and smell the sharp tang of spices. They have no way of knowing that the redness is volcanic clay, the firmness is embalming fluid, and the meat itself is a vessel for parasites. The physical results were a plague of gastric fevers. Thousands died of what we now know was food poisoning, salmonella, E. coli, and botulism, but which the Victorians simply called the bowels complaint. The meat that was supposed to build the muscles of the working man was instead introducing microscopic invaders that hollowed him out from the inside. The butcher wipes his blade on a blood-stained apron and closes the heavy wooden shutters. Behind him, the carcasses hang in the dark, silent and chemically altered. The city sleeps, while in a million stomachs, the butcher's secret begins its slow, agonizing work, turning the substance of life into the source of a quiet urban tragedy. As the Victorian era progressed, the challenge of feeding a global empire led to a revolutionary invention, the tin can. Originally designed for the Royal Navy to prevent scurvy and starvation during long sea voyages, canned food soon trickled down into the urban markets. To the Victorian housewife, the tin was a miracle of modern science. It promised fresh peaches in the dead of winter and beef that would stay edible for years. It was the birth of the ultimate convenience food, the first true ancestor of the modern supermarket aisle. But this miracle came in a container that was, quite literally, a slow poisoning device. In the mid-1800s, the technology of canning was crude. The cans were made of heavy tin-plated iron, and the lids were sealed by hand. To create an airtight seal, workers used a generous bead of lead solder. As the cans sat in warehouses or on grocers' shelves, the acidic contents, whether it was tomatoes, fruit, or salted meat, began a chemical reaction with the lining. The lead from the solder would leach directly into the food. For the consumer, there was no warning. Lead is a cumulative poison. It does not kill instantly. Instead, it settles into the bones and the brain. A family that switched to a diet of canned convenience foods was unknowingly microdosing themselves with a heavy metal that causes profound neurological damage, extreme fatigue, and lead palsy, a weakening of the wrists and ankles. The most famous tragedy of the tin occurred during the ill-fated Franklin expedition to the Arctic in 1845. Sir John Franklin and his 128 men vanished while searching for the Northwest Passage. For decades, their fate was a mystery. When their remains were finally discovered and analyzed over a century later, researchers found staggering levels of lead in their systems. Their modern canned rations had poisoned them, leading to madness, paranoia, and physical collapse in the frozen wastes. Back in the smog-filled streets of London, the rise of the tin was creating a similar, albeit slower, disaster. Because there were no regulations on how food was processed before it was sealed, the junk often went in before the lid was soldered shut. Canned meat was frequently reprocessed, meaning meat that had already begun to spoil was boiled at high temperatures to kill the smell, then shoved into a tin. The high heat killed the bacteria, but it also destroyed any remaining vitamins, leaving the consumer with a tin of flavorless, lead-laced fiber. As you drift further into relaxation, imagine the sound of a Victorian pantry, the faint, metallic clink of tins being stacked. They look so sturdy, so reliable. But inside the dark vacuum of the tin, the lead was migrating. The convenience of the meal was a trade-off for the clarity of the mind. Children whose developing brains are most sensitive to lead were the silent victims. The dullness or irritability, often attributed to poor upbringing in the slums, was in many cases the result of a diet transitioning from the fresh, though often fake, to the processed and preserved. The tin can allow the British Empire to expand to the corners of the earth, but it did so by carrying a cargo of heavy metals in its wake. The convenience of the industrial age was starting to show its teeth. The more modern the food became, the more detached it was from the biological needs of the human body. The tin was a silver-colored tomb, preserving the food but slowly destroying the life of the person who ate it. By the year 1850, the stomach of the British public had become a dumping ground for the Industrial Revolution's chemical waste. People were dying, children were failing to grow, and the national health was in a state of quiet collapse. Yet the government remained idle. The prevailing philosophy of the time was caveat emptor, let the buyer beware. It was argued that if a man was foolish enough to buy bread made of plaster, that was his own misfortune. But in a small, dimly lit room in London, a physician named Dr. Arthur Hill Hassall was about to change the course of history. Unlike the politicians, Hassall didn't just listen to the rumors of the marketplace. He used the most powerful weapon of the age, the microscope. Hassall was a man of obsessive detail. He realized that while the human eye could be fooled by dyes and fillers, the lens of a microscope could not. In 1851, he partnered with Thomas Wackley, the fiery editor of the medical journal The Lancet, to form the Analytical Sanitary Commission. Their mission was simple but revolutionary. They would buy ordinary food from ordinary shops, analyze it, and publish the results, including the names and addresses of the shopkeepers who were selling poison. Imagine Dr. Hassall sitting at his desk, the silence of the night broken only by the scratching of his pen. Under his lens, a simple pinch of pure coffee revealed itself to be a nightmare. It wasn't just coffee beans, it was roasted chicory, scorched wheat, mangel-wurzel, and even acorn coffee. More disturbingly, he found that many coffee substitutes were colored with black lead and Prussian blue to give them a rich appearance. When he turned his microscope to sugar, he found it crawling with sugar mites, tiny, translucent insects that lived in the unrefined. Brown sugar sold to the poor. He looked at the pure cayenne pepper and found it was 50% red lead and mercury. He looked at the pickles and saw the copper crystals clinging to the vegetable fibers like jagged emeralds. Hassall's work was the first time the junk food of the Victorian era was exposed with scientific certainty. Week after week, The Lancet published his findings. The public was horrified. For the first time, a mother could read the name of the grocer on her corner and see, in black and white, that the flour she was buying for her children was actually 30% stone dust. The shopkeepers were furious. They threatened lawsuits and violence. They argued that everyone did it and that the public demanded cheap prices. But Hassall was unmoved. He was a man of the cold, hard truth. He didn't just find the poison, he measured it. He showed that the cumulative effect of these small daily doses was what was filling the hospitals and the graveyards. As you breathe softly, imagine the flickering candlelight in Hassall's laboratory. Each slide he prepared was a piece of a puzzle, a map of a nation's betrayal. He was the first to prove that the modern diet was not a sign of progress, but a systematic assault on the human body. He took the boring history of grocery lists and turned it into a battle for the very survival of the working class. The Analytical Sanitary Commission was the beginning of the end for the unregulated junk food era. It pulled back the curtain on the butcher's secret and the baker's dust, showing that behind the vibrant colors and the white loaves lay a landscape of industrial debris. The microscope had revealed the invisible war being waged in every kitchen in England, and once the truth was seen, it could never be unseen. The city remained dark, but for the first time there was a glimmer of hope. The science of health was finally catching up to the chemistry of greed. Chapter 11: The Lancet's War. The publication of Dr. Hassel's findings was not merely a report, it was a declaration of war. Thomas Wackley, the combative editor of The Lancet, understood that science alone would not change the habits of a nation addicted to profit. He needed to incite a revolution in the pantry. And so, beginning in 1851, the journal launched a campaign of public shamming that the Victorian world had never seen before. Wackley did something unprecedented. He printed the names. In previous eras, if a grocer was caught watering his milk or sanding his sugar, the matter was handled quietly, if at all. But Wackley and Hassel published the blacklist. Week after week, the respectable medical journal listed the names and addresses of the specific shops where adulterated goods had been purchased. Mr. John Smith of 124 Oxford Street, the entry might read, sold coffee found to contain 45% chicory and burnt beans. The reaction was explosive. For the shopkeepers, this was a catastrophe. Their reputations, built on the facade of respectability, were shattered overnight. They formed trade associations to fight back, hiring lawyers to threaten the Lancet with libel suits. They argued that adulteration was simply customary trade practice, and that the public actually preferred their mustard to be bright yellow with turmeric and flour, rather than the dull brown of the natural seed. They claimed that Hassel's microscope was a lying instrument. But the public was waking up. The Victorian consumer, previously a passive victim of the industrial food chain, began to look at their dinner table with suspicion. The Lancet's war turned the kitchen into a forensic crime scene. Housewives began to test their tea leaves and examine the sediment in their milk jugs. The blind trust between the neighborhood grocer and the family was broken. The press joined the fray. Punch magazine, the satirical giant of the age, published cartoons mocking the great British grocer. They depicted skeletons weighing out sugar and devils mixing vats of beer. The junk food that had been accepted as a necessary evil of city life was now being framed as a moral crime. The shopkeeper was no longer a pillar of the community. He was a poisoner in an apron. However, the war was not easily won. The food lobby was powerful. They had friends in Parliament, men who owned the very factories producing the alum and the red lead. These politicians argued against regulation, crying out about free trade and the liberty of the subject. They claimed that if the government started testing food, it would be the end of British enterprise. They painted Wackley and Hassel as meddling radicals who wanted to destroy the economy. But the science was undeniable. Hassel continued his work, moving from coffee to bread, from vinegar to spices. He developed new chemical tests to detect the invisible. He found that even the drugs sold to cure the stomach aches caused by the food were themselves adulterated. It was a closed loop of toxicity. As you listen to the steady rhythm of this history, imagine the tension in the gaslit streets. A grocer nervously eyes the customers entering his shop, wondering if one of them is an agent of the Lancet. A mother holds a loaf of white bread to the light, looking for the telltale glint of crystal alum. The Lancet's war was a war of nerves, fought not with guns, but with chemistry sets and printing presses. The medical community, previously aloof and concerned only with treating the sick, was forced to realize that medicine was useless if the patient was being poisoned 3 times a day. The doctor and the grocer were now adversaries. The junk food empire was under siege, its walls of plaster and chicory beginning to crumble under the relentless gaze of the microscope. The city sleeps, but the printing presses of the Lancet are thundering through the night, churning out the truth that will eventually save millions of lives. The first battle had been won, but the war for a pure meal was far from over. The revelations of the Lancet and Dr. Hassel could not be ignored forever. The public outcry reached the stone corridors of Westminster, and for the first time, the British Parliament was forced to confront the fact that its citizens were being slowly poisoned by their own commerce. In 1855, a parliamentary select committee was formed to investigate the adulteration of food, drink, and drugs. Imagine the scene: a high-ceilinged committee room, thick with the smell of polished oak and cigar smoke. Sitting in the witness chair is Dr. Arthur Hassall. Before him sit the MPs, men of wealth and influence, many of whom believed that business should never be interfered with. Hassall did not bring speeches, he brought evidence. He laid out his samples: the alum-whitened bread, the copper-green pickles, the lead-laced cayenne. He showed them the microscopic truth of the British diet. The testimony was damning. One by one, experts confirmed that the roast beef of Old England was being served with a side of industrial chemistry. The committee was shocked. They heard stories of publicans who frankly admitted to using strychnine because the people expect a bitter beer. They heard from chemists who sold tons of daff, plaster, to sweet makers, knowing full well it would end up in the stomachs of children. After years of debate, the result was the Adulteration of Food and Drink Act of 1860. It was a historic moment, the first general food safety law in the English-speaking world. But as the ink dried on the parchment, it became clear that the law was a hollow victory. It was a paper tiger. The act had a fatal flaw. It was permissive, not mandatory. It stated that local authorities could appoint a public analyst to test food, but it did not say they had to. In the corrupt ecosystem of Victorian local politics, the town councils were often run by the very grocers, bakers, and brewers who were doing the adulterating. Naturally, they saw no need to appoint an analyst to investigate themselves. Furthermore, the law required the prosecution to prove guilty knowledge. This meant that to convict a grocer of selling poisonous candy, you had to prove that he knew the candy was poisonous when he sold it. The grocer simply had to say, "I didn't know, I bought it from the wholesaler like that," and he would walk free. The burden of proof was impossibly high. As a result, the 1860 Act was almost entirely ignored. In London, only a handful of analysts were appointed, and they were often paid a pittance and given no laboratory to work in. In the industrial north, where the food quality was worst, the act was treated as a joke. The junk food industry breathed a sigh of relief. They had faced the government and won. The poisoning continued, now with the tacit understanding that the law was too weak to stop it. The Victorian consumer was left in a dangerous limbo. They had been told the food was poisonous. They had seen the government pass a law, but the bread on their table was just as white and stony as before. The 1860 Act was a testament to the power of the free trade ideology, the belief that the market would correct itself. But the market had no conscience. It would take more than a polite piece of legislation to stop the flow of copper and lead. It would take a tragedy so visible and so heartbreaking that even the staunchest defender of deregulation would be forced to act. The city sleeps under a blanket of smog, the law tucked away in a dusty archive, while the alum mills grind on through the night, preparing the morning's deceptive loaf. Chapter 13. The Bradford Sweets Poisoning. In the timeline of Victorian food history, there is one date that stands out in black ink: Halloween, 1858. While the politicians in London were debating the theoretical rights of the free market, the people of Bradford were about to pay the ultimate price for that freedom. Bradford was a gritty, smoky city in West Yorkshire, the heart of the wool trade. It was a place of hard work and small comforts. One of those comforts was the peppermint lozenge, locally known as a humbug. On the crowded stalls of the Green Market, a man named William Hardacre, known to the locals as Humbug Billy, sold these sweets for pennies. He was a familiar face, a purveyor of cheap treats to the factory workers and their children. But Humbug Billy did not make his own wares. He bought them from a wholesale confectioner named Joseph Neal. And Joseph Neal, like so many others, did not use pure sugar. The price of sugar was too high for the penny market. So Neal used a substitute known in the trade as daff. Daff was typically a mixture of plaster of Paris, powdered limestone, or sulfate of lime. It was a neutral, indigestible filler that allowed the confectioner to bulk up the product without spending money. On a quiet day in late October, Neal sent a messenger to the local druggist, a man named Charles Hodgson, to purchase his usual supply of daff. Hodgson was ill and laid up in the back room, so the request was handled by his young, inexperienced assistant, William Goddard. Goddard went down into the cellar. It was dark, illuminated only by a weak candle or perhaps just the grey light filtering from the street. In the corner there were two unmarked casks standing side by side. One contained the harmless plaster of Paris. The other contained arsenic trioxide, a deadly poison sold for agricultural pest control. In the dim light, the white powders looked identical. Goddard plunged his scoop into the wrong cask. He weighed out 12 pounds of pure arsenic, wrapped it in paper, and sold it to the messenger as daff. The poison was carried back to the sweet maker, a man named James Appleton. As Appleton began to mix the daff into the molten sugar and gum, he noticed something was wrong. The mixture looked different. It didn't stiffen the way it usually did. Appleton himself felt sick while leaning over the vapors of the pot, suffering from waves of nausea. But in the Victorian junk food economy, waste was a sin. He finished the batch, creating 40 pounds of peppermint humbugs. Each sweet contained enough arsenic to kill 2 men. On Saturday evening, Humbug Billy set up his stall in the Green Market. The gas lamps hissed overhead, casting a yellow glow on the deadly pile of sweets. He sold them by the ounce. Children spent their allowances. Fathers bought bags for their families. Billy himself ate a few and soon fell violently ill, leaving his stall early, but the sales continued. By Sunday morning, the city of Bradford was waking up to a nightmare. Across the town, healthy people were suddenly struck down with agonizing stomach cramps, vomiting, and convulsions. At first, the local doctors were baffled. The symptoms looked exactly like cholera, the great scourge of the slums. They treated the patients with opium and warmth, but nothing worked. The victims turned blue and cold, their pulses fading into nothingness. It wasn't until the afternoon that the connection was made. All the victims had eaten humbugs from Billy's stall. The police seized the remaining sweets and tested them. The result was terrifying. The lozenges were almost solid arsenic. The town bellman was sent running through the streets, ringing his bell and shouting a warning. Do not eat the sweets, they are poison. But for many it was too late. 21 people died, many of them children. Over 200 others were left permanently damaged, their nervous systems shattered by the acute poisoning. The tragedy of the Bradford sweets poisoning was the Chernobyl of the Victorian food industry. It was a disaster so visible, so horrific, and so clearly caused by the lack of regulation that it could not be explained away. As you imagine the silence that fell over Bradford that Sunday night, the blinds drawn, the families in mourning, you are seeing the absolute bottom of the barrel. This was the moment the Victorian public realized that the invisible hand of the market held a cup of poison. The innocent act of buying a sweet had become a game of Russian roulette. The shock of Bradford rippled out from Yorkshire to London, shamming the government and silencing the lobbyists. The ghosts of those children, poisoned for the sake of a cheaper filler, would eventually force the empire to change its laws. But for now the city sleeps in mourning, a dark monument to the dangers of an unregulated world. The ghosts of Bradford haunted the halls of Parliament for nearly 2 decades. The permissive law of 1860 had failed, and the public's patience had finally worn thin. By the early 1870s, the Victorian consumer was no longer just suspicious. They were angry. They were tired of the bread faces, the chalky milk, and the metallic tea. The scientific community, led by the successors of Dr. Hassall, had formed the Society of Public Analysts, a group of dedicated chemists who refused to let the issue of food purity fade into the background. In 1875, the government finally realized that the health of the British worker was essential to the health of the British Empire. You cannot run the world's factories and navy with a population whose bones are made of plaster and whose blood is thinned by lead. And so, the Sale of Food and Drugs Act of 1875 was born. Unlike its predecessors, this act had teeth. It was designed to close the loopholes that the junk food manufacturers had exploited for 40 years. First, the law removed the impossible requirement of guilty knowledge. It no longer mattered if a grocer knew his butter was actually lard and orange dye. The mere act of selling it to the prejudice of the purchaser was now a crime. If the food was not of the nature, substance, and quality demanded by the customer, the seller was liable. This shifted the responsibility from the victim to the vendor. Secondly, the act made the appointment of public analysts mandatory in every district. No longer could a corrupt town council of bakers and brewers vote to ignore the law. Every city, every borough, and every county was required to have a laboratory and a chemist whose job was to hunt for the baker's dust and the copper greens. As you imagine the gaslights of 1875, see the inspectors walking the streets with a new sense of authority. They would enter a shop, purchase a pound of coffee, and immediately seal it into 3 separate containers, one for the shopkeeper, one for the analyst, and one for the court. The shadow industry of adulteration was suddenly under a constant legal spotlight. The results were transformative. Within just a few years of the Act's passage, the percentage of adulterated food samples plummeted. The lye tea disappeared from the docks. The milk dealers stopped reaching for the boric acid and started investing in faster transport. The bakers realized that it was cheaper to bake honest bread than to pay the heavy fines and face the public shamming that the new law enforced. But perhaps the most significant change was psychological. For the first time in the industrial age, the government had asserted that the safety of the human body was more important than the freedom of the market to cheat. The Act of 1875 created the framework for the modern food safety systems we take for granted today. It established the principle that when you buy food, you have a right to know exactly what is in it. The junk food that had destroyed millions of Victorian lives did not vanish overnight, but its reign of terror was broken. The 1875 Act was the turning point where the science of nutrition began to triumph over the chemistry of greed. The city is quieter now. The frantic, toxic competition of the mid-century has been replaced by a new era of regulation and oversight. The people still live in the soot and the fog, but their daily bread is finally becoming bread once more. The long, slow poisoning of a nation was coming to an end. As we reach the end of our journey through the soot-stained kitchens and chemical laboratories of the 19th century, the morning fog begins to lift. The Victorian era did not just leave behind grand cathedrals and sprawling railways. It left behind a biological scar on the DNA of a nation. The junk food crisis was over in its most lethal, acute form, but the long recovery had only just begun. The legacy of decades spent consuming alum, lead, and arsenic was visible in the very stature of the people. When the British Army began recruiting for the Boer War at the end of the century, they were horrified to find that nearly half of the urban volunteers were physically unfit for service. These men were the children and grandchildren of the Great Migration. They were stunted in growth, their teeth were prematurely rotted, and their bones were weakened by the rickets of the plaster-bread era. But from this wreckage, the modern world of health was born. The horrors of the Victorian pantry forced the birth of nutritional science. Doctors realized that it wasn't enough for food to be not poisonous. It had to be nutritious. This shift in thinking led to the discovery of vitamins and the understanding of how minerals like iron and calcium build a human life. The boring history of food regulation became the foundation of the modern public health state. As you drift toward the edge of sleep, consider the world Arthur Hassall helped create. Today, when you look at a label on a cereal box or a bottle of milk, you are looking at the direct descendant of the Lancet's war. The lists of ingredients, the expiration dates, and the health inspections are the safeguards built upon the tragedies of the past. We no longer fear that our bread contains piped clay or that our pickles are dyed with copper coins. The butcher's secret has been replaced by the refrigerated truck and the sterile processing plant. However, the Victorian era also left us a more complex inheritance. It taught us that junk food is not just about the ingredients, but about the distance between the producer and the consumer. The more we rely on industrial processes to feed us, the more vigilant we must be. The Victorian struggle was against adulteration, the adding of poisons. Our modern struggle is often against ultra-processing, the stripping away of nutrients. The names have changed, but the tension between profit and pulse remains. The story of Victorian junk food is a reminder of human resilience. Despite being fed masonry and heavy metals, the people survived, they fought back, and they demanded a better world. They turned the microscope on greed and forced the law to recognize the sanctity of the human stomach. The Victorian streets are finally silent. The gas lamps have been extinguished, replaced by the steady glow of the modern world. The clatter of the alum mills and the hiss of the copper vats have faded into the archives of history. You are safe, you are nourished, and you are far removed from the era of baker's dust. The long recovery continues, but for tonight the battle is over. The record is closed. The city and its history can finally rest. For decades we have looked at the streets of London and Manchester, but the Victorian junk food crisis was not contained within the fog of the British Isles. As the workshop of the world, Britain exported its industrial philosophy across the oceans. The 1,500-word reality of this era begins with the massive, creaking hulls of merchant ships, carrying the British diet to the furthest reaches of the empire. Imagine the hold of a ship bound for India or Australia in 1865. Inside, thousands of crates are stamped with the names of prestigious London firms. To the colonial clerk or the soldier stationed in the heat of the tropics, these crates represented home. But inside those crates was the same baker's dust and milk of death we have already uncovered, now subjected to months of tropical heat and damp salt air. The Victorian obsession with shelf life reached its zenith on the high seas. Because food had to survive a 4-month journey without refrigeration, the use of preservatives became even more aggressive. The butter sent to the colonies was often not butter at all, but a substance called oleomargarine, a mixture of rendered beef fat, milk, and a staggering amount of salt and borax to keep it from turning rancid. By the time a British officer in Calcutta spread it on his toast, he was consuming a chemical paste that had more in common with industrial grease than dairy. The global trade created a feedback loop of filth. Britain would import raw materials, sugar from the Caribbean, tea from China, cocoa from West Africa, and process them in the unregulated factories of the North. They would then sell the adulterated, value-added versions back to the very people who grew the raw ingredients. Consider the Victorian cocoa trade. In its raw form, cocoa is bitter and fatty. To make it palatable and cheap for the masses, manufacturers would strip away the nutritious cocoa butter and replace it with potato flour, sago, or even brick dust for color. This junk cocoa was then marketed as a health tonic for the poor in the colonies. It was a global cycle of malnutrition, fueled by the British penchant for chemical manipulation. As you listen to the imagined creak of the ship's timbers, think of the millions of people across the globe whose first taste of modernity was a mouthful of British-made plaster and lead. The empire was built on many things, but it was fueled by a diet of deceptive calories. The long recovery we spoke of in Chapter 15 was not just a British recovery. It was a global struggle to reclaim the purity of food from the hands of the industrial chemists. The sea is vast and dark, and beneath the waves the ship moves forward, carrying its cargo of sophisticated poisons to every corner of the map. The Victorian junk food crisis was the world's first truly global health disaster, a quiet plague that traveled by sail and steam. To understand how 1,200 words of history can stretch into a deeper, 1,500-word meditation, we must look at the physical space where this food was prepared. The Victorian slum kitchen was not a place of culinary art. It was a place of survival, and its very design contributed to the destruction of lives. Visualize a rookery in East London. The room is 10 feet square, housing a family of 8. There is no running water. There is no oven. The only source of heat is a small coal-fired grate that serves as both the heater and the stove. In this environment, real cooking, the slow roasting of meats or the simmering of fresh stews, was physically impossible. This architectural poverty created a total dependency on ready-to-eat junk food. Because the working class had no way to cook raw ingredients, they relied on the cookshop. These were the Victorian versions of fast food outlets. A woman would take a basin to the cookshop and buy a scoop of peas pudding or a slice of grey meat. These shops were the primary users of the butcher's secret. They bought the scraps that no one else wanted, the organs, the diseased trimmings, and the slink meat, and disguised them in heavy, floury gravies thickened with toasted breadcrumbs, which were often just ground-up waste bread. The lack of ventilation meant that the fumes from the coal fire, mixed with the smell of the formaldehyde beef, created a toxic atmosphere. The lead paint on the walls flaked off into the food. The water, carried in buckets from a communal pump shared by 100 people, was used sparingly. Vegetables were rarely washed. The junk food of the Victorian era wasn't just about what was in the food, but the filth it was prepared in. The kitchen was the heart of the home, but in the Victorian city, the heart was diseased. The architecture of the slum ensured that even if a family had access to better food, they had no way to prepare it safely. They were trapped in a cycle of convenience of the damned. As you breathe in the still air of your own room, contrast it with the heavy, stagnant air of the tenement. The silence of the night is a luxury that the Victorian worker never knew. In the slums, the sound of the city never stopped, and the struggle to eat a clean meal was a 24-hour battle against the very walls of the house. Chapter 18. The Poison Palette, the Chemistry of Victorian Food Coloring. To understand the sheer scale of the Victorian food crisis, one must imagine the grocery store not as a larder, but as an artist's studio, specifically, the studio of a painter who had no regard for the toxicity of his pigments. In the mid-19th century, the visual appeal of food was everything, in a world of grey smog and brown brick. The psychological craving for color was a powerful force. Manufacturers exploited this by using the poison palette, a collection of industrial dyes and mineral pigments that were never intended to be touched by a human tongue, let alone digested. If you were to walk into a high-end Victorian confectioner's, you would see a dazzling array of colors: vibrant emerald greens, brilliant sky blues, deep vermilion reds, and sunny yellows. To the modern eye, these colors would look unnaturally fluorescent. To the Victorian, they looked rich. However, the chemistry behind these colors was a map of the heavy metal industry. Let us begin with the color green. We have touched on the copper greens of pickles, but for sweets and cake decorations, the preferred pigment was Scheele's green, cupric arsenite. This was the exact same pigment used in the infamous Victorian green wallpapers that were known to kill people in their sleep. When used in food, the arsenic didn't just stay on the surface, it migrated into the sugar. A child eating a green-dyed marzipan leaf was ingesting a concentrated dose of one of the world's most effective poisons. The arsenic acted as a slow-moving neurological disruptor, causing mysterious skin rashes, hair loss, and a lingering, painful death that doctors often mistook for consumption. Then there was the red. To achieve a deep, luscious crimson in jellies, jams, and cheap sausages, manufacturers used red lead tetroxide, or vermilion mercuric sulfide. Lead, as we know, is a cumulative neurotoxin. Mercury, however, is even more sinister. It attacks the central nervous system directly. The Mad Hatter of Lewis Carroll's imagination was a reality in the Victorian age because of mercury used in felt making. The Mad Eater was a reality because of mercury used in food coloring. Chronic mercury poisoning led to tremors, extreme emotional instability, and erethism, a state of intense shyness and irritability that destroyed many a Victorian's social and professional life. For the yellows and oranges, the chemist reached for chromate of lead chrome yellow. This was a favorite for coloring custard powders and egg substitutes. Because real eggs were expensive, egg powders were sold to give cakes a rich, golden hue. These powders were often nothing more than flour and cornstarch dyed with lead chromate. A Sunday sponge cake, meant to be the highlight of a family's week, was often a vehicle for lead poisoning. The yellow was bright and cheerful, but inside the body, the lead was settling into the bone marrow, stunting the growth of children and causing chronic anemia in adults. Even the blues and purples were not safe. Prussian blue, ferric ferrocyanide, and indigo were used to color tea leaves and sugar. While Prussian blue is less toxic than arsenic, it was often extended with gypsum or chalk to make it cheaper, further diluting the nutritional value of the food. The most tragic part of the poison palette was that it was entirely unnecessary. Natural dyes existed: saffron for yellow, cochineal for red, spinach juice for green, but they were expensive and faded quickly under the harsh gaslights of the shops. The industrial pigments were cheap, permanent, and vivid. The Victorian food manufacturer chose the pigment that wouldn't fade, regardless of whether the customer survived to buy a second portion. As you breathe in the quiet of the night, imagine the vibrant, toxic glow of these foods. The Victorian dinner table was a gallery of industrial waste. The people were eating paint. They were decorating their lives with the very substances that were hollowing them out from within. The junk food of this era was a masterpiece of visual deception, where the beauty of the color was directly proportional to the lethality of the dose. The pigments were ground in the same mills that ground the flour. The vats were stirred with the same spoons that stirred the jam. The separation between the factory and the kitchen had vanished, leaving a nation to feast on a rainbow of lead, mercury, and arsenic. Chapter 19. The Adulterated Apothecary, when the medicine was poison. In the modern world, if we feel the gnawing pain of indigestion or the sharp spike of a fever, we turn to the pharmacy with a sense of absolute trust. We expect that the white pill or the amber liquid in the bottle is exactly what the label claims it to be. But for the Victorian citizen, the apothecary was often the final, cruel stage of the junk food cycle. After a lifetime of eating alum-bleached bread, copper-laced pickles, and lead-coloured sweets, the Victorian body was frequently in a state of chronic distress. When they turned to medicine to soothe their scorched stomachs and failing nerves, they often found that the cure was as adulterated as the food that had made them sick in the first place. The Victorian medicine cabinet was a dark reflection of the grocery store. Because there were no strict regulations governing the manufacturing of drugs until late in the century, the druggist's shop was a laboratory of unregulated chemistry. If you were a worker in Manchester suffering from the gastrics, the common name for the chronic vomiting and diarrhea caused by food poisoning, you might buy a bottle of peppermint water or tincture of rhubarb. However, the peppermint was often extended with turpentine or wood naphtha. The rhubarb was frequently bulked out with sawdust or dyed with the same red lead that colored the sausages. Even the most basic of remedies, like castor oil, was often diluted with cheap, rancid fats or mineral oils. The patient, already weakened by a diet of industrial waste, was now introducing further irritants into an inflamed digestive tract. Perhaps the most sinister aspect of the adulterated apothecary was the soothing syrup. In the 1850s and 60s, thousands of working-class mothers, forced to return to the factories just days after giving birth, relied on these syrups to keep their infants quiet. Known by names like Mother's Friend or The Quietness, these bottles contained a lethal secret. While they were advertised as containing pure herbs, their primary ingredient was often laudanum, opium, or morphine, mixed with thick molasses to hide the bitter taste. But the molasses itself was a byproduct of the sugar refining process and was often contaminated with lead. The soothing syrup was a double-edged sword. It drugged the child into a stupor, masking the hunger pangs caused by watered-down milk, while simultaneously delivering doses of heavy metals and narcotics. Many Victorian children suffered from what was called the marasmus, a slow wasting away. They were not just starving, they were being chronically sedated by a medical industry that prioritized quiet children over healthy ones. Even the chemicals used for basic hygiene were compromised. If a Victorian family wanted to purify their water using chloride of lime, they might find that the powder had been mixed with common salt or gypsum to increase its weight. If they bought magnesia for a sour stomach, they were often swallowing nothing more than powdered chalk. The entire infrastructure of health was built on a foundation of sand, or rather, a foundation of industrial debris. As you breathe deeply and feel the weight of your own comfort, imagine the desperation of a Victorian father standing in a dimly lit apothecary shop. He is spending his last few pennies on a tonic for his ailing wife. He trusts the man behind the counter, the man with the brass scales and the Latin-labeled jars. He doesn't know that the quinine in the bottle, meant to fight a fever, is actually a mixture of starch and a bitter chemical called quassia, which has no medicinal value. He is buying hope in a bottle, but the bottle contains only more of the same junk that has already compromised his family's survival. Dr. Arthur Hassall, in his relentless pursuit of purity, eventually turned his microscope toward these medicines. He found that nearly 70% of the common drugs sold in London were adulterated. He discovered that even the opium sold for pain relief was often mixed with sand and dried leaves to make it weigh more. There was no sanctuary. From the baker's oven to the doctor's desk, the Victorian was surrounded by a conspiracy of chemicals. This was the medical junk food of the age. It was a system that profited from the very illnesses the industrial food chain created. It was a closed loop of misery. The food made you sick, and the medicine kept you sick. The long recovery we spoke of was not just about cleaning up the pantry. It was about reclaiming the very idea of a cure from the hands of the poisoners. The gas lamps in the apothecary's window flicker and die. The jars of blue and green glass sit silent on the shelves, their toxic secrets hidden by beautiful labels. The city sleeps, but its dreams are drug-induced and troubled. Nations searching for a remedy in a world where the medicine was just another form of the poison. As we sink deeper into the quiet of the night, we must address the most addictive and destructive substance of the Victorian era: sugar. In the modern world, we speak of sugar as empty calories, but to the Victorian it was far more sinister. It was the white gold of the empire, a substance that reshaped the global economy and, in the process, rotted the very foundation of the British population. At the start of the 19th century, sugar was a luxury for the wealthy. But by the 1850s, the sugar kings, the massive refinery owners and plantation magnates, had succeeded in making it a staple of the working-class diet. It became the primary source of calories for the urban poor. When a laborer couldn't afford meat or fresh vegetables, he reached for the sugar bowl. It provided a quick, cheap burst of energy that allowed him to keep working his 14-hour shift. But this energy was a biological loan with a punishing interest rate. The sugar junk food of the Victorian era was not just about the sweetness, it was about the filth of the refining process. Before the mid-century regulations, sugar arrived in the London docks as a raw, brown, sticky mass. To turn it into the white crystals favoured by the public, it had to be purified. In the massive, steaming refineries of the East End, this meant boiling the sugar with bullock's blood or bone-black, charred animal bones to clarify the liquid. While these were standard industrial practices, the lack of hygiene in these factories meant that the sugar was often contaminated with animal hair, dirt, and bacteria. But the real horror lay in what was added to the sugar to make it go further. Because sugar was sold by weight, grocers and wholesalers had a powerful incentive to bulk it. The most common additive was DAF, that ubiquitous mixture of plaster of Paris and chalk we have seen in the bread and sweets. However, they also used sand, starch, and even wood sawdust. A Victorian worker, stirring a spoonful of sugar into his lead-laced tea, was often drinking a slurry of industrial minerals. The physiological impact of this high-sugar, high-adulterant diet was catastrophic. The most visible sign was the Victorian mouth. Because there was no fluoride, no dental hygiene, and a diet consisting of 20% refined sugar, the teeth of the working class literally dissolved. By the time a man reached his 20s, it was common for him to have lost half his teeth. This wasn't just an aesthetic issue. It meant that as they aged, they could no longer chew healthy, fibrous foods like apples or coarse grains, forcing them further into a diet of soft, processed junk, porridge thickened with plaster and tea soaked in molasses. Even more hidden was the impact on the blood. The Victorian era saw a massive spike in what they called the sweet malady, which we now recognize as type 2 diabetes. However, Victorian doctors had no way to test for blood sugar. They only noticed when their patients began to waste away, suffering from extreme thirst and blindness. They treated these patients with more tonics, often containing more sugar and alcohol, unknowingly accelerating their decline. As you breathe slowly, imagine the massive sugar warehouses lining the Thames. The air there was thick and cloying, a scent of rot and sweetness mixed together. Millions of tons of this refined poison moved through these gates every year. It was the fuel of the Industrial Revolution, but it was a fuel that burned out the human engine. The sugar kings became some of the wealthiest men in history, building mansions and funding galleries, while the people who consumed their product grew pale, toothless, and weak. The rot of the empire started in the mouth and moved to the marrow. The sugar provided a temporary illusion of strength, a sweet mask for a nation that was physically hollowing out. The night is still, and the sugar in the dark pantries of the city sits in its jars, a white, crystalline lie. The era of the Sugar Kings was the era when humanity first learned how to crave the very thing that was destroying it. The addiction was complete, and the cost would be paid in the health of generations to come. As the first grey light of a Victorian morning would begin to creep over the chimney pots, the city would stir not to the smell of fresh, roasted beans, but to a sharp, acrid scent that hung heavy in the damp air. For the burgeoning middle class and the aspiring clerk, coffee was the drink of the modern intellectual man. While tea was for the domestic hearth, coffee was for the counting house and the bustling street. It promised a sharp mind and a sophisticated palate. Yet in the 1850s, the morning ritual was perhaps the greatest deception of all. If you were to purchase a tin of pure mocha from a London grocer, the contents were often a masterpiece of industrial mimicry. Because coffee beans were heavily taxed and expensive to ship, the temptation to stretch the product was irresistible. The most common additive was chicory, the root of a blue-flowered perennial plant. While chicory is not inherently poisonous, the Victorian trade used it as a gateway for much darker substances. To make the chicory look like coffee, it had to be roasted until it was a deep, dark brown. But roasting chicory often resulted in a burnt, charcoal-like substance. To restore the oily sheen and rich color of genuine coffee, manufacturers added lard, mangel-wurzel, a type of coarse beet used for cattle feed, and scorched wheat. But the most disturbing discovery made by Dr. Arthur Hassall was the presence of coffee colorer. This substance, sold in large casks to grocers, was a concentrated dye made of black-laid graphite and Prussian blue. The goal was to give the coffee a deep, uniform color that wouldn't fade when mixed with the watered-down, chalky milk of the era. As the Victorian worker sipped his morning cup, he was consuming the same materials used to polish cast-iron stoves. But the deception went even deeper into the literal dirt of the earth. Because coffee was sold in a ground, powdered form, it was the perfect vessel for weight loading. Hassall found samples that contained roasted carrots, acorns, and red earth Armenian bole. In the most desperate districts, coffee was found to contain finely ground Venetian red, a pigment made of iron oxide. The morning ritual was not providing a caffeine kick. It was providing a dose of heavy minerals and scorched vegetable matter that sat like silt in the stomach. The physiological effect was a state of chronic gastric irritation. The tannins in the fake coffee, combined with the metallic dyes, eroded the lining of the esophagus and stomach. The nerves that Victorians often complained of, a state of jittery exhaustion, were not just the result of caffeine, but of the body's attempt to process the non-biological additives. They were in a state of constant, low-level chemical poisoning. Imagine the quiet scratching of a pen in a London office. The clerk takes a sip of his bitter draught, believing it will help him focus on his ledgers. Instead, the graphite and the lead chromate are slowing his digestion and clouding his mind. The very symbol of Victorian wakefulness was, in reality, a muddy slurry of industrial byproducts. The morning ritual was a lie sold in a tin. It was a junk food that pretended to be a luxury, a substance that promised energy but delivered only inflammation. As the sun rises higher in the Victorian sky, the streets fill with people fueled by scorched beets and iron oxide, a nation of workers whose very breakfast was a testament to the unregulated greed of the industrial age. The steam rises from the cup, carrying the faint, metallic scent of the factory into the home. The morning has begun, but the body is already under attack. As the Victorian day moved into the afternoon, we must look at the sharp side of the pantry. In an age before domestic refrigeration, vinegar was more than just a condiment. It was a vital preservative, a cleaning agent, and a culinary essential. It provided the bite in pickles, the tang in sauces, and the base for the sharp preserves that accompanied the heavy, often grey meats of the city. However, the vinegar of the mid-19th century was rarely the simple fermented product of cider or wine. It was a liquid of vengeance, a chemical cocktail that burned the throat and eroded the health of those who relied on it. To produce genuine vinegar, one needs time. The natural fermentation of alcohol into acetic acid is a slow process that requires patience and quality raw materials. But the Victorian junk food manufacturer had neither. To meet the massive demand of the urban poor and the industrial pickling factories, chemists discovered a much faster way to achieve that signature sharpness. They turned to sulfuric acid, oil of vitriol. Sulfuric acid is a powerful mineral acid used today in car batteries and fertilizer production. In the 1850s, it was used to fortify weak, watered-down vinegar. A manufacturer could take a barrel of genuine vinegar, dilute it with 5 barrels of water, and then add a splash of sulfuric acid to restore the burn on the tongue. To the unsuspecting consumer, the vinegar felt strong and brisk. In reality, they were ingesting a corrosive substance that was slowly decalcifying their teeth and causing ulcerations in the lining of their stomachs. But the vinegar of vengeance did not act alone. It was the primary vehicle for the copper greens we have discussed in earlier chapters. When the sulfuric-laced vinegar was poured over gherkins or cabbage in large copper boiling vats, a chemical reaction occurred. The acid would leach the copper from the sides of the vat, creating copper sulfate, blue vitriol. This chemical would then be absorbed by the vegetables, turning them a vibrant, unnatural, and fresh-looking green. When Dr. Arthur Hassall began his investigation into the London pickle trade, he was horrified by what he found. Out of 33 samples of pickles purchased from various grocers, every single one contained copper. In many cases, the amount of copper was so high that it could be plated onto a steel knife blade simply by dipping the knife into the vinegar jar. The sharp pickles that Victorians ate to aid digestion were, in fact, delivering a heavy dose of a gastric irritant that caused chronic nausea, liver damage, and systemic inflammation. The deception extended even to the fancy sauces of the day, such as Worcestershire or catsup. To give these sauces a rich, dark color and a mature flavor, manufacturers used burnt sugar, logwood, and even walnut husks, which were often contaminated with the lead-based dyes used to color the walnut shells for the decorative market. The vinegar used as the base for these sauces was almost universally adulterated with mineral acids to keep the price at a penny a bottle. The physiological consequences were particularly cruel for the poor, because their diet was so monotonous and their meat so often near-spoiled. They relied on vinegar-based condiments to mask the taste of decay. They would drench their grey meat in vitriol vinegar, unknowingly adding a chemical burn to a meal already lacking in nutrition. The indigestion and heartburn that became a hallmark of the Victorian working-class experience were not just the result of poor food, but of the very substances used to make that food palatable. Imagine a Victorian family sitting down to a meal of bread and a few scraps of pickled cabbage. They take comfort in the sharpness of the vinegar, believing it to be a healthy stimulant for the appetite. They have no way of knowing that the vibrant green of the cabbage is a sign of copper poisoning, or that the bite in the liquid is the same acid used by the local tanner to dissolve hair from animal hides. The vinegar jar sat on every table, a clear liquid with a dark, acidic secret. It was a junk food that pretended to be a preservative, a substance that promised to keep food fresh but instead contributed to the slow internal erosion of the consumer. The vengeance of the chemical industry was silent and invisible, leaching into the very fabric of the Victorian body, one sharp, sour bite at a time. The shadows of the afternoon lengthen, and the scent of vinegar hangs in the air of the narrow streets, a sharp, stinging reminder of a world where even the most basic of seasonings was a weapon of industrial greed. As the sun began to set over the jagged skyline of Victorian London, the milk walk would begin. This was the hour when the milkmaids and milkmen would roam the streets, their wooden yokes creaking under the weight of heavy pails. To the Victorian mind, milk was the ultimate symbol of purity, the white nectar that sustained the most vulnerable members of society, the infants, the elderly, and the infirm. But in the reality of the industrial city, milk was often the most dangerous substance in the pantry. It was a white lie that carried within it the seeds of disease and the chemicals of the laboratory. The deception began at the very source, the town dairy, because it was impossible to transport fresh milk from the countryside into the heart of London before it soured. Thousands of cows were kept in cowhouses within the city limits. These were not the rolling green pastures of the imagination. They were dark, subterranean vaults or cramped, filth-encrusted sheds located in the middle of the slums. The cows lived their entire lives in darkness, standing knee-deep in their own waste. They were fed distillery swill, the hot fermented mash left over from the production of gin. This acidic, low-nutrient diet caused the cows to become feverish and alcoholic. Their teeth rotted, and their bodies became riddled with bovine tuberculosis. The milk they produced was thin, bluish, and watery, often containing pus and blood from infected udders. To make this swill milk appear like rich country cream, the milk of death underwent a terrifying transformation. First, it was heavily diluted with water, often taken from the same communal pumps that were contaminated with the sewage of the city. To restore the white color and the body of the diluted liquid, manufacturers added chalk, plaster of Paris, or starch. To give it a creamy yellow tint, they stirred in annatto or even chrome yellow, lead chromate. But the most sinister addition was boric acid or formaldehyde. These preservatives were used to stop the watered-down milk from smelling of rot. While they kept the milk sweet to the nose, they were devastating to the human digestive system, especially for infants. The formaldehyde hardened the proteins in the milk, making it almost impossible for a baby to digest. A Victorian infant, fed on this white lie, was often starving even as its stomach was full of chemical-laden sludge. The biological cost was staggering. It is estimated that in the 1840s and 50s, nearly 20% of all infant deaths in London were directly attributable to the milk of death. The tuberculosis from the cows passed directly into the children, causing scrofular tuberculosis of the neck and tabes mesenterica, a slow, agonizing wasting away of the abdominal organs. The public, unaware of the microscopic war being waged in their pitchers, simply saw their children grow pale and thin, attributing the deaths to unlucky constitutions, rather than the bluish liquid in the nursery. Dr. Arthur Hassall's investigation into the milk trade was one of his most explosive. He found that out of hundreds of samples, almost none were pure. He found samples containing sheep's brains, mashed into the milk to create a thick, creamy head. He found iron oxide to mimic the color of rich Jersey milk. The white nectar of the countryside had been replaced by a grey, chemical soup that was essentially a delivery system for pathogens and heavy metals. As you breathe in the stillness of your room, imagine the sound of the milkman's bell echoing through a foggy London street. To a mother, that bell was the sound of nourishment. She would walk to the door with her jug, oblivious to the fact that the liquid being poured was a cocktail of distillery waste, lead, and tuberculosis. The white lie was the most intimate betrayal of the Victorian age, a poisoning of the very source of life. The urban dairy was a factory of death, operating in the heart of the city, hidden behind the facade of freshness. The junk food of the nursery was the ultimate price paid for the rapid, unregulated growth of the industrial world. The purity of the milk was a myth, and the reality was a tragedy that claimed the lives of the most innocent. The night deepens and the empty milk pails are stacked in the dark, sour-smelling sheds. The city sleeps while the milk of death begins its silent, microscopic work in the cradles of the poor, a white shadow falling over the future of a nation. If milk was the white lie of the Victorian nursery, then bread was the stone foundation upon which the entire industrial empire was built. For the 19th century laborer, bread was not merely a side dish, it was the meal. It was common for a working-class man to consume 2 pounds of bread a day, accounting for nearly 80% of his total caloric intake. But as the population of the cities exploded, the pressure to produce a white loaf, the ultimate symbol of status and purity, at the lowest possible cost, led to a systematic contamination of the national diet known as the baker's dust. In its natural state, flour made from whole grain is slightly off-white or yellowish. However, the Victorian consumer, influenced by the aristocratic preference for refined wheat, demanded a loaf that was as white as a fresh sheet of paper. To achieve this snow-white appearance while using cheap, low-grade, or even spoiled flour, bakers turned to a chemical bleaching agent, alum potassium aluminum sulfate. Alum is an astringent mineral used in the tanning of leather and the production of paper. When added to flour, it performs a deceptive miracle. It reacts with the proteins in the wheat to whiten the color, and more importantly, it allows the dough to hold more water. This meant a baker could produce a larger, heavier loaf using less flour. To the Victorian worker, the loaf looked pure and felt substantial. In reality, they were eating a sponge of water and industrial minerals. The physiological impact of alum bread was profound and cumulative. Alum is an irritant to the mucous membranes of the digestive tract. It interferes with the body's ability to absorb nutrients, particularly phosphoric acid, which is essential for bone growth. This led to a generation of children suffering from the rickets, a softening of the bones that resulted in bowed legs and deformed spines. The baker's dust was literally weakening the skeletons of the British people. Furthermore, the astringent nature of alum caused chronic constipation, a condition so prevalent in Victorian cities that it created a massive market for the adulterated apothecary drugs we discussed in Chapter 19. The people were trapped in a cycle. The bread they ate for survival caused internal blockages, and the tonics they took to find relief were themselves laced with lead and mercury. But alum was only the beginning of the dust. To further bulk out the loaf, unscrupulous bakers added fillers that make the modern stomach churn. Dr. Arthur Hassel's microscopic investigations revealed that bread was frequently padded with ground bones, plaster of Paris, chalk, and potato starch. In some cases, even piped clay was used to give the bread a heavy, firm texture. This was not food. It was masonry disguised as a meal. The conditions in the bakeries themselves added another layer of horror. Most urban bread was baked in underground cellars located beneath the street level. These rooms were damp, poorly ventilated, and infested with rats and cockroaches. The heat from the ovens, combined with the lack of sanitation, meant that the baker's dust often included the sweat of the workers and the debris of the vermin that shared the space. The purity of the white loaf was a mask for a process that was, in every sense of the word, filthy. As you lie in the quiet of your own home, imagine a Victorian street at 4:00 a.m. The only light comes from the glowing orange embers of the cellar bakeries. You can hear the rhythmic thud of the bakers kneading the dough, a dough filled with alum, bone dust, and plaster. By 7:00 a.m., these loaves will be on the tables of 1,000,000 families, a white breakfast that is slowly eroding the health of a nation. The baker's dust was the ultimate junk food because it was unavoidable. You could choose not to buy green pickles or lead-colored sweets, but you could not choose not to buy bread. It was the staff of life, but in the hands of the Victorian industrialist, it had been turned into a staff of stone. The whitening of the nation was, in reality, a process of slow internal calcification. The ovens grow cold as the morning sun rises, but the baker's dust has already begun its journey into the blood and bone of the city. The bread is white, the profit is high, and the cost is measured in the stunted growth of a generation that thought it was being nourished. As the Victorian era matured into the late 19th century, the hunger for expansion to the frozen poles, the deep jungles, and the farthest reaches of the naval frontier created a desperate need for food that could ignore the laws of decay. The solution was the tin can, a marvel of the industrial age that promised to stop time. It was the ultimate convenience, the precursor to every processed meal we know today. But in the hands of the Victorians, the tin can was often a vessel for a slow, metallic death, the tin terror. The danger of the Victorian tin was twofold: what was inside the food and what was inside the container itself. In the mid-1800s, the process of canning was an industrial craft, not a sterile science. The cans were constructed from heavy sheets of tin-plated iron, hand-rolled into cylinders. To make them airtight, a thick bead of lead solder was applied along the side seams and around the lid. Lead, a soft and malleable metal, was the perfect sealant for the factory, but it was a nightmare for the human body. As the cans sat in the holds of ships or on the shelves of general stores, the food inside began a slow chemical dialogue with the container. If the contents were acidic, such as canned tomatoes, peaches, or vinegary meats, the acid would leach the lead directly out of the solder. The food didn't just touch the lead, it absorbed it. By the time a soldier or an explorer opened his fresh ration, he was often consuming a meal that was heavily contaminated with a cumulative neurotoxin. The physiological impact of lead poisoning, or plumbism, was insidious. It didn't strike like a fever, it eroded the person from within. It settled into the brain, causing irritability, memory loss, and a state of lead palsy, where the nerves in the wrists and ankles would fail, leaving the victim's hands hanging limp. Because these symptoms appeared slowly, they were often dismissed as exhaustion or scurvy, especially on the frontier where conditions were already harsh. The most harrowing example of the tin terror occurred during the Franklin expedition of 1845. Sir John Franklin set out with 2 ships, the Erebus and the Terror, to find the Northwest Passage. They carried 3 years' worth of canned provisions, 8,000 tins of meat, soup, and vegetables. They never returned. When their remains were found decades later, and eventually exhumed in the 1980s, the soft tissues of the sailors revealed staggering levels of lead. The tins that were supposed to save them had likely contributed to their madness and physical collapse. Imagine the scene in the frozen Arctic, men already struggling with the cold, their minds clouded by lead-induced paranoia, unable to make the rational decisions needed to survive, all while eating the very modern food they trusted to keep them alive. But the terror wasn't limited to the Arctic. In the cities, cheap tins became a staple for the poor. Because the canning process involved boiling the food at high temperatures, manufacturers used the tin to hide the butcher's secret. Meat that was already on the verge of putrefaction was boiled into a grey, fibrous mush and sealed away. The heat killed the bacteria, but it did nothing to remove the toxins produced by the decay, nor did it replace the vitamins destroyed by the overcooking. The Victorian junk tin was a nutritional vacuum. It offered calories and the illusion of meat, but it provided no vitality. A family living on canned bully beef and tinned fruit was essentially starving on a cellular level, their bodies deprived of vitamins C and B12, while their blood was slowly enriched with lead. As you breathe in the cool air of the present, imagine the sound of a Victorian hammer striking the laid solder into place. Clink, clink, clink. Each strike was sealing a fate. The convenience of the tin was a trade-off that the Victorian consumer didn't know they were making. They were the first generation to outsource their food safety to a factory, and the factory prioritized the seal over the soul. The tin terror represents the moment when food became a product rather than a source. The tin was a barrier between the human and the earth, a silver-grey tomb for the nutrients of the past. The long, slow poisoning of the frontier was the price paid for the ability to carry London into the wild, a metallic legacy that would take nearly a century to fully understand and rectify. The night is silent, and the heavy iron tins sit on the dark shelves of history, their leaden seams holding back the rot, but slowly leaching the life out of the meals they were meant to protect.